International banks and giant transnational corporations are without doubt the primary beneficiaries of war, but they're not the only beneficiaries. Equally strident voices for war may be heard from the various public bodies with direct interests in the mayhem and misery of war, such as the armed services, for example, the so-called intelligence services and police forces, all of whom have very personal reasons for ensuring their elected masters are continually provoking wars and triggering security alerts somewhere or another. All of these supposed public services are mini empires, led by individuals whose sole purpose in life is the enlargement of their personal kingdoms. A peaceful world is the very last thing these people would wish for. And these are the self-same souls charged with advising our elected leaders. Referring to the so-called intelligence services, Kolko describes it like this. The most significant aspect of intelligence has been the astonishingly great extent to which those paid to produce it distorted it, or the rulers of nations ignored that part that did not justify their misconceived and dangerous preconceptions and policies. President Truman also remarked on this, but only 10 years after he had left office. Those fellows in the CIA don't just report on wars and the like, he said. They go out and make up their own, and there's nobody to keep track of what they're up to. They spend billions of dollars stirring up trouble, so they'll have something to report on. It's become a government all of its own and all secret. They don't have to account to anybody. Then there's the CIA's big brother, the National Security Agency, which has recently had far more publicity than it likes thanks to Edward Snowden. But long before Snowden, writer Tim Weiner said this: "No public law defines or limits the NSA's powers and responsibilities. The only known mention of the agency in public laws of the United States is a 1959 statute that states, 'Nothing in this act or any other law shall be construed to require the disclosure of the organization or any function of the National Security Agency.'" And then there's the even more secretive National Reconnaissance Office. Now, there's nothing especially original about any of this. As I've shown, many writers have made basically the same observation. The only purpose of war is power and plunder for the super-rich, the dreaded 1%. The plunder of artificially manufactured enemies by ruthless rich people, and the plunder of ordinary taxpayers by equally ruthless public servants. The ordinary citizen has been obliged to support and finance the raiding expeditions of his trusted leaders for many centuries. What's especially cynical about the whole thing, however, is the way the citizen is continually tricked and lied to by these same trusted leaders in order that she never tumbles to the fact that the great and glorious causes for which she believes she is sacrificing not only her flesh and blood, but her meagre earnings too, is all a sham, an elaborate smokescreen to disguise the real cause of war, plunder for the super-rich, and the building of pointless empires for powerful government mandarins. That our leaders are continually successful in this illusion from one generation to the next is down to a ruthlessly efficient system honed by ruling elites over many centuries, albeit much of it unconsciously. Because the children of the super-rich are brainwashed to assume their superior roles in life just as efficiently as the children of the poor are conditioned to accept their inferiority. It begins with systematic and lifelong grooming starting at school, and is blindly reinforced by religious figures and most of our friends and families. We have all been subjected to it, and we all perpetuate it. I have done so myself. It's almost impossible not to. The 1% and their flunkies invariably dismiss these concerns, together with a mountain of evidence of the criminality of their actions, as conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theorists are typically people who actively promote a particular theory about some dreadful event being caused by the sinister machinations of persons unknown, without any substantial evidence to support their theory. So here's the good news. The issues I talk about are definitely no conspiracy theory. But here's the bad news. It's much, much worse than that. It's all completely normal. Conspiracies are considered to be very rare events. They imply the sudden emergence of some evil genius that has temporarily invaded and seized control of an otherwise well-ordered machine run by wise and compassionate leaders. Whilst a few of our leaders may be wise, very few could be considered compassionate, given the unimaginable carnage, human suffering and misery over which they routinely preside every day of the week, generation after generation. If the intentions and actions of our trusted leaders were so good and noble, why do they need to keep so many of their intentions and actions secret? Why do they employ hundreds of thousands of people in the so-called intelligence community, whose sole purpose in life is to do things which must be kept secret from those of us who must pay the salaries of all these people? Why do they employ millions of others in the police and armed forces, whose actions are kept secret from those of us who must pay their salaries? Why is it that almost no one has heard of the relatively new monstrous creation of the empire called the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC? JSOC is well described in investigative journalist Jeremy Scahill's superb book, Dirty Wars, which should be mandatory reading in every school in the country. JSOC is a terrifying collection of professional murderers working for the American empire who can and do wreak havoc all over the world, which they see as a battlefield. But to describe what these people do as warfare gives it a dignity it does not deserve. For these people who work for the US government are merely cold-blooded murderers who routinely ignore national and international law. There's nothing conspiratorial about any of this. It's all horrifically normal. There are literally millions of people working for our trusted leaders and whose salaries we must provide, doing things every single day of the week that we're not allowed to know about. And when we are occasionally told about them by real heroes such as Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden, it's the whistleblowers who are persecuted, not the spies, murderers or their controllers. That's not a conspiracy, that's a fact. We live in a world populated by mostly good and honest people who just want to get on with their lives, but who have always been, and continue to be, systematically abused and manipulated by ruthless plutocrats, consumed by insatiable appetites for limitless wealth and power for themselves. A real conspiracy would be considerably easier to deal with and overcome. What we have to deal with instead is an ancient system so completely rotted through and so relentlessly evil that it's essentially unchanged since the beginning of civilization, a self-perpetuating mechanism run by elites for elites and endlessly fueled by war, interspersed with brief respites where war-weary people may be regrouped for the next war, made by their own trusted leaders, terrorizing them with newly fashioned threats of alien attack. The biggest threat to the real security of those of us lucky enough to live in the first world comes not from people we think of as criminals, nor from those we're conditioned to think of as terrorists. The biggest threat to us comes from our own trusted leaders, tiny handfuls of respectable men in suits, pillars of their communities who are no doubt loved by their families and are kind to small children and animals. Perhaps they go to church regularly and make sizable donations to charities. When they get very old, some of them might become philanthropists, establishing their own charities to help airbrush from history the part they played in the misery and suffering that made them so rich and powerful in the first place. It's from this group of people, the 1%, that the real threat to our security exists, together with the future of the entire planet. A very important subject that must also be considered in relation to security is economic security. As I'll be doing a talk on in the near future focusing wholly on economics, I've not mentioned it today. But economic security is every bit as important as our physical security and must not be overlooked in any discussion concerning this subject. However, this talk has concentrated mainly on physical security and how it's deliberately abused by our trusted leaders in the most abominable of all human actions, war. Mere words are not able to describe the full horror of war. It has to be experienced firsthand to appreciate just how monstrous it really is. War is not some sudden and unexpected natural disaster about which we can do nothing, like a tsunami or an earthquake or a volcano. Wars are started deliberately by very evil people who know that it won't be their lifeblood seeping away in some sun-baked desert or frozen wasteland, nor that of their sons and daughters. The permanent pestilence of war is the most compelling argument of all for why we have to change, and change a lot. I hope this talk has served to sketch the difference between the first duty of government, which is providing real physical security for people, without sacrificing our freedom and murdering defenceless civilians in faraway countries, and what our trusted leaders actually deliver, which is permanent war crime. I've tried to show that permanent war crime is not something about which the trusted leaders of the first world countries can do absolutely nothing, but is in fact something they deliberately create, maintain and nurture for their own personal profit and power. I've tried to show this is no conspiracy theory, it's entirely normal. We have hundreds of thousands of people whose daily work is kept highly secret from us, in spite of the fact that we pay their huge salaries. When whistleblowers such as Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden try to shine a little light on some of the actions of these vast armies of people who operate in absolute secrecy every day of the week, it's the whistleblowers who are viciously persecuted, tortured and imprisoned, whilst the monsters whose actions they expose not only get away scot-free, they are often richly rewarded, honoured and praised. The hundreds of thousands of people who make and maintain secrets every day of the week are no conspiracy, nor are the victimised whistleblowers who try to let us know what they're up to. They are all frighteningly real. This is all entirely normal, and it has absolutely nothing to do with keeping us secure. I've tried to show that security is another one of those words which, when used by our trusted controllers, means something entirely different from what we hope or expect. It's perfectly possible to have a really secure and free world where permanent peace and freedom is the norm instead of permanent war and oppression. And the School of Kindness project is singularly dedicated to that purpose.